The 13th century in Eastern Europe. In the West, the expansion of knightly orders, in the East the Mongols. And between these two insane forces, there is one small state of the Baltic pagans, which is destined to become a grand duchy, to exist for 600 years, and, in union with Poland, to reach an imperial scale from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The last pagans of Europe, who defended their independence in the conflict with the Crusaders, Europeans without Christianity, or even an alternative Russia. The ancestors of modern Lithuania and Belarus generally enjoy a fairly positive reputation among historians. Their story is too curious. But there is one character in it that no one usually likes at all. This is the only king in the history of Lithuania. In general, its creator is Prince Mindovg. Prince Mindovg. His image is so not very good that the medieval rulers of Lithuania preferred to start their history either with the ancient Romans or with Gediminas, but not with this character. Hello everyone, I am Yeger, and you are on the Airfield channel, where we talk about the dead and the dead, about history. And today let's remember how the Lithuanian state appeared and talk about its founder. And in this story, there will be everything that we love: medieval wars, murders of relatives, and, of course, changing shoes in the air of all participants. If you see this, it's time to buy gifts at low and green prices on Yandex Market. The Baltic tribes lived in the remote forests of northeastern Europe for centuries, and few people were interested in centuries. But somewhere from the 7th century, Vikings began to visit them to plunder. But even this entertainment was quite rare, because the locals didn't have that much of value. Things got worse and more fun when two Slavic states appeared next door, Poland and Kievan Rus. Poles and Russians attacked the Balts much more effectively. Large squads coped with this task better than small crews of drakars. By the 11th century, Balts appear on the pages of chronicles and in the notes of preachers. True, they are all compressed there in Lithuania. The Yatvyagi are depicted specifically. First of all, they are all terribly bloodthirsty and constantly kill someone. Merchants, missionaries, travelers. And in response to these atrocities, of course, the Russian and Polish princes make their campaigns. And secondly, all these peoples in the Slavic chronicles are conquered and pay tribute to the Slavs. Modern historians believe that both are untrue, because the terrible bloodthirstiness of the Balts, apparently, simply served as an excuse for Slavic campaigns, and the Balts did not pay regular tribute to anyone in principle. For the simple reason that they had huge dense forests where you could go so far, that even the tax inspectors would be afraid to follow you there. So the tribute in these texts is just loot from a predatory raid. And most often, this tribute was captured locals, who were then sold as slaves to Byzantium. After all, both Poles and Russians were already Christians, and the Byzantines treated their fellow slaves badly, so the Slavic princes, in order not to lose this profitable slave trade business, began to sell their pagan neighbors. For the first 100 to 150 years, these attacks were one-sided, the Slavs attacked, and the Balts did not go to them with return visits. There is a version that the Baltic peoples simply possessed a valuable resource, amber, which was traded with the Romans. Therefore, the character of these tribes was quite peaceful, and merchants and priests played a more important social role than wars. But during the raid, of course, everything has changed. Military leaders, whom the Russians called princes, began to come to power. More and more men gathered in their squads, whose descendants would become local nobles in the future. And when Lithuania and Poland form a joint state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it will become almost a unique place in Europe, where the nobility will make up about 1/10 of the population. The only comparable region in Europe will be Spain with its centuries-old Reconquista. Just look at the figures, say, in France or in Russia, by the end of the 19th century. There will be only 1 or 2% of the nobility. So already in the 12th century, when the disintegration, civil strife and bloody collapse began in Kievan Rus and the Polish kingdom, the Balts recouped. Their squads were hired by neighbors eager to kill each other. War booty began to flow into the deep forests, and the locals appreciated such a progressive scheme of earnings. Their tribes enthusiastically turned to the raiding economy. Lithuania especially liked this case the Baltic tribe, who lived closest to the Russian land. They started out as mercenaries, but then they just started robbing former employers right up to the distant Chernihiv lands. In 1219th year, Lithuania was mentioned for the first time in a diplomatic context. It was the Walloon-Lithuanian Alliance Treaty. In the south of the former Kievan Rus, the Galician-Volyn Principality was just beginning to rise. Whose young prince was going to take Gallic from the Poles, hiring Lithuanian squads for this. From the side, the last contract was signed by as many as 21 princes, of whom 5 were named the eldest. And from about this moment, the more or less official unification of the Lithuanian tribes is counted. And it will be headed by one of these senior princes named Mindovg. He is Mendek, Mend, Mindziuta, Mendelev, as they say. Here they are from left to right. Well, or Mindaugas, the latter name is used in modern Lithuania. Well, it was difficult for the neighbors to remember Lithuanian names exactly. My favorite variation is, of course, Mendelf. Where this man came from, we have no idea. We also don't know anything about its origin. Russian chroniclers mentioned him as a representative of the Polotsk nobility. The Poles considered him a Prussian. And the Lithuanians themselves, a few centuries later, would build his family back to Roman times, of course. Directly to the era of Emperor Nero. It seems like he was still from the local nobility, but there is such confusion with his father there, that it's easier to put up with the Emperor Nero, believe me. With age, similar nonsense, like the year of birth 1200, plus or minus 5 years. And considering that in 1219 he was already a Grand Duke, it's probably less insulting to think that minus 5 years. The joint campaign with the Russians turned out to be both successful and unsuccessful. The Volhynians and Lithuania were able to take Gallic from the Poles, but soon the Hungarians came up. And again Gallic was taken away from them. And after this story, Mindovg disappeared for a long 17 years, and we don't know what happened to him there. But when he reappeared in 1236th year, as we know from the Livonian rhymed chronicle, he was already the ruler of all Lithuania. And how he won this leadership is not very clear. Some chronicles, however, dully mention that Mindovg had to kill his relatives for this, and in fact, we have no reason to doubt it. A new force has emerged, the Knights' Orders, which began a crusade to conquer the Baltic lands. From the west, the Teutonic Order, invited by the Poles, moved towards them, and from the north, from the newly founded Riga, the Order of the Sword. Kievan Rus finally collapsed, and the Principality of Polotsk collapsed, and instead of them, hundreds of small principalities appeared on the map, most of which we only know the names of. And this is not counting the fact that the Mongols were already approaching Russia from the east. And in the Russian principalities bordering Lithuania, Lithuanian princes begin to rule. And somehow it happened to be one big mystery. There are no reports of wars and seizures. It's just that suddenly a man named Teftvil, Mindovg's nephew, and one of the influential Lithuanian princes, suddenly appears on the throne of ancient Polotsk, instead of the traditional Vislavs and Brichislavs. How did he end up on the throne of Polotsk, for which the descendants of Vikings from the Rurik dynasty gnawed for centuries? There you go. Well, Polotsk, after the capture of the Dvina estuary by the swordsmen, quickly lost its significance. Instead, the cities of Novgorod, Slonim, and Volkovisk are beginning to strengthen in the region. And Lithuanian princes are also appearing in them. They come under the power of Mindovg, who puts his son as prince in the most important city of Novgorod, the current Novogrudek. And again, no reports of a conflict. Moreover, it is known that Mindovg was friends with the Novgorod prince. They were allies and went on military campaigns together. Historians have offered several explanations. Some believe that the fact was that the Russian princes who were killing each other simply could no longer protect their subjects. So the cities began to peacefully go under the rule of Lithuania, which also did not repeal the old laws, and did not introduce new ones, because it did not have state traditions, and did not manage the cities much before. Lithuania did not impose anything, but even adopted some laws and institutions from the locals. But there is a more interesting explanation, however, which does not contradict the previous one. Lithuania remained pagan, and its expansion in the 13th century into Russian lands is perceived by some as a kind of pagan reconquista. Russians, in fact, of course, there is no evidence that the Lithuanian princes returned the old faith on Russian lands. And moreover, we even have reports that, on the contrary, they themselves were baptized on Russian lands. However, it seems to many historians that in the early Middle Ages, the epic clash of Christianity with pagan orders was somehow lacking, and the monks and chroniclers simply kept silent about everything, and they consider this peaceful expansion to be one of the proofs. They say that Christianity has not yet fully taken root in the people, and at the first opportunity, uneducated people rushed to resurrect the old faith, forgetting about Christianity, because here they are, beautiful Lithuanians with their perkunos. Religious confrontation also explains the mystery of the name of this region. It was simultaneously called both Black Russia and White Russia. Allegedly, where there were more pagans, Russia was called Black, and the more Christianized lands were called White Russia, which gave the name to the modern state on those lands. All of these are very nice theories, of course, but they are not confirmed by anything. Both Black and White Russia appeared later, and these names, most likely, had no religious overtones. For example, the cardinal directions were associated with colors. This is a very common tradition among different peoples, primarily among the steppe. The nomads considered the north black, the west white, the south red, the east blue, and the center gold. Hence the division of the Joki Ullus into the golden, blue and white horde. Perhaps in the case of White and Black Russia, some similar principle worked. In any case, it is unlikely that Mindovg himself was a religious person. He changed his faith repeatedly. For the first time, according to one late chronicle, in 1246 year, when he converted to orthodoxy. However, historians have a lot of questions about this particular case, well, simply because there are many claims to the document that claims it. Meanwhile, the peaceful incorporation of the cities of Black Russia into the newly formed state of Lithuania took place in parallel with the great upheavals in Eastern Europe. In the north, the Bishop of Riga and the Order of the Sword, who had been accused in Rome for several years of being too close to the Russian heretics, and they really got very close, were forced to subscribe to the crusade announced by the Pope against the pagan tribe of the Zhemites. The Crusaders gathered all their forces, called on their allies, and moved to the territory of modern Lithuania, planning to pass along the coast and unite in the modern Kaliningrad region with their brothers from the Teutonic Order. However, the dwarves surrounded them in the swamps and killed almost all of them. Hardly 20 of the 200 soldiers returned to Pskov. 48 knights of the sword were killed, including their master. The order was defeated, and the following year its remnants entered the Teutonic Order as the Livonian branch. This victory at Šauliai had a very positive effect on the morale of all Baltic pagans. All the tribes conquered by them recently rebelled against the Crusaders. Mindovg himself, characteristically, did not participate in this battle. But one of the Lithuanian princes Vikand commanded the pagans. But an even greater shock in the winter of the very next 1237th year struck Eastern Europe from the east. In a year, the Mongols crushed the northeastern Russian principalities, ravaged their cities, massacred the nobility, and went to the steppes. Surprisingly, the South Russian principalities are like all of this. They didn't notice. Chernihiv and Galicians continued to fight with each other and, apparently, were very surprised when a year later the Mongols returned and passed fire already on their lands, then went further to Europe. It so happened that the Lithuanian lands were almost untouched by the conquerors. But the Russian political and military system in its former form was completely destroyed. And Lithuania immediately began to fill the power vacuum throughout the 40s, including new principalities and making raids, and becoming more and more like a single state. In the 45th year, Mindovg was already called the Supreme King, who ruled all the lands of Lithuania and some of its neighbors. However, he, had his typical problems. There are too many princes, too many pretenders to power, so we had to invent a traditional medieval trap plan. He sent the most dangerous competitors for the power of the Vikand and his nephew Toptevil on a campaign to eastern Russia. In 1248th year, the campaign ended in failure, and, apparently, it was planned. At least, Mindovg decided to take advantage of this and either sent assassins to them, or deprived them of their hereditary inheritance, or tried to do both together. It was an extremely unfortunate decision, because the angry princes gathered an amazing coalition of Orthodox Galicians, Catholic Crusaders and pagan Zhemites against him, and then all together attacked the lands of Mindovg, with a firm decision to catch and kill the father of Lithuanian statehood. This strange association itself shows how much many were frightened by the unification of Lithuania and the rise of Mindovg itself. It would seem that there is no salvation for him. Mindovg hid in the castle, while his enemies ravaged his lands, but then he showed himself to be a virtuoso medieval diplomat. The Mindovgs were bribed for a lot of money by the master of the Teutonic Order and the pagan tribes, after which they all withdrew from the war, and the Mids retained their power. But this is all a story about the internal policy of Avik. The external one was no less epic. The fact is that the appearance of the Mongols and their military power made an indelible impression on Europeans. The Europeans sent several scouts to the east and found out that the Mongols suddenly left Europe, not because God saved it, but because the supreme ruler died in distant Karakoram, and they went to share power. It was clear that when the Mongols sorted themselves out, they would immediately return and go on crushing European countries. And indeed, Guyuk, a participant in the Western campaign, was soon recognized as the Great Khan, who, shortly after his election, sent a letter to the Pope threatening him and demanding to recognize the Khan's authority. This vague threat greatly impressed everyone in Rome, and they decided to create several buffer states between themselves and the Mongol Empire, whose tasks would be to stop a new invasion. The Pope offered the royal crowns to three rulers, Mindovg, Daniel Galitsky, and Alexander Nevsky. The latter was closest to the Mongol stake on the Volga and preferred to give up the crown, instead building normal relations with Bachu. The other two crowns were accepted, counting on the help of Europeans. In particular, the Pope promised them nothing less than to organize a crusade in the event of a new invasion of the Mongols. However, in general, Mindovg probably didn't think much about the latter. It was more important for him to establish relations with the Teutonic Order. Mindovg and his wife Marta converted to Catholicism, and in 1253 year, the Lithuanian prince was crowned as the king of Lithuania. The exact date of the coronation is unknown. Even in our time, Lithuanian historians have calculated that it took place on the 6th of July, which is now celebrated in Lithuania as the day of the formation of the state. His relations with the order immediately improved, especially since Mindovg handed over to the knights a part of the lands that belonged to the Žemaitė tribe, from which, by the way, modern Lithuanians also originate. He generally disposed of the lands and people under his control quite easily. After all, His Majesty's private property. What can you do about it? He gave part of the lands to the order in order to preserve a profitable alliance for himself. Thanks to this, the Crusaders were able to connect the possessions of the Teutonic and Livonian orders. After his death, the number of lands signed by the knight will be so huge that historians are still arguing which of these letters are real, and which Teutons themselves forged. They will then justify their claims to the Baltic lands for another 100 years by saying that these are just lands that His Majesty Mindovg gave them. By the way, His Majesty dealt with people living on all these lands even more simply. He stupidly sold them to knights. Mindovg's increased position helped him solve problems with other enemies as well. With Daniel Galitsky, another new king, he got the title of King of Russia. They agreed in an interesting way. Their main dispute was about who should rule Black Russia, and resolved it so that the Knyazov in Novgorod became the son of Daniel. But at the same time, this son was considered a vassal of Mindovg. Apparently, such an elegant solution was invented not even by Mindovg himself, but by his son Wojciech, who then reigned in Novgorod. Wojciech was generally a very interesting person. The chronicles describe him as an absolutely frostbitten type. Wojciech began to reign in Novogródek in the paganism of the future and began to shed a lot of blood, as he killed 3 or 4 every day. On what day I didn't kill anyone, I was sad. When he killed, then he was cheerful. The uneasy character inherited by him soon aggravated the war with religious fanaticism. If his father Mindovg treated the faith cynically, and paganism, Catholicism, and orthodoxy, depending on the political situation, then Wojciech became orthodox once and for all, devoutly believing. His lifestyle has changed, and now he has been disappearing 4 years in Orthodox monasteries, praying for the salvation of his soul. On the other hand, this is a story about a man who was such a pagan beast, and then converted to Christianity, and changed into a real person. In principle, the monks wrote this about every ruler who adopted the Christian faith. For example, in Russian history, Prince Vladimir experienced the same moral transformation. Historians believe that Vishilk went to the monastery, of course, not out of love for God, and generally not particularly at will. It just seems that this whole scheme, where cities are given to the Russians, while they remain vassals, was done behind the back of the Lithuanian monarch himself. And the Orthodox son of the ruler, who had just converted to Catholicism, also somehow did not look very ill-fought. In short, Wojcielka had no reason to hide from his father's eyes, and he went to the monastery. In some rather strange, dubious status. He seemed to be a monk, but from time to time, he left this monastery, and staged a more or less large-scale bloodshed, robbed something there, and then returned back to books and prayers. And then he founded his own monastery. Female. And that's what I don't want to comment on at all, to be honest. Of the two new kings, only Daniel Galitsky decided to seriously resist the Mongols. But Mindovg, in the Defender of Europe, somehow did not really aim, and probably did the right thing. The king of Russia managed to put together an anti-Mongol coalition with the Russian princes, brothers of Alexander Nevsky. And they even inflicted several defeats on the Mongols. However, then the power in Karakorum changed, Bachu strengthened from the position of the ruler of the Golden Horde. And he sent his army on a punitive campaign. Nevsky's brothers were defeated, Daniel Galitsky had to admit defeat, tear down the fortification of his cities, go to the Volga, and confirm his submission to Bachu. After this humiliation, Galitsky was forced, together with the Mongols, to go on a campaign against all his former allies, whom he himself incited to revolt against the Mongols. They also reached the lands of Lithuania, burned the cities of Black Russia, inflicted several defeats on the Lithuanians. But they could not conquer their lands, because there were deep forests and swamps. And this is the worst landscape for the Mongol cavalry that can be imagined at all. Mindovg, as he usually did not defend any of his subjects, but ran away and hid in the thicket, where the Mongols naturally could not find him. They left, in general, with nothing, and Lithuania received a formidable reputation as an anti-horde force, with which the Mongols can do nothing, well, except burn stupidly those lands that they could reach. This reputation has greatly helped the Lithuanians in further expansion into Russian lands. Russian princes lost their independence for a long time and became part of the Jokiulis, while Lithuanian ones offered some alternative to those Russians who did not want to fall under the Mongols. And what about the Pope and his promised crusade, by the way? But in general, nothing, no hike happened. After that, the authority of Catholics in Eastern Europe was shaken. Moreover, the Teutonic Knights suffered several serious defeats from the Baltic tribes. Mindovg looked at all this and refused Catholicism, returning to the good old paganism. And then he made an alliance with the Orthodox princes. They went to war with the order together, however, not very successfully. Mindovg was not a particularly conscientious person all his life, but by old age, he had become just a completely unbearable type. In 1263 year, he went on a campaign to Bryansk, and in this campaign, his wife Marta died. And this is absolutely trash. Mindovg found a replacement for his wife right at the memorial pen in the form of the younger, sister of the deceased. Because yes, they were very similar to her, and Mindovg decided that it was very convenient. You know, it's hard to get used to something new at that age. Your sister dying told me to take you for myself. They say another will not bring up children, he informed his sister-in-law, and immediately took her as his wife. The fact that she was already married, and her husband Prince Davmont was present at the wedding, our hero lover was not confused. So soon, during the same campaign, this same Prince Davmont, alone, drove into the royal camp, calmly crossed it, because everyone knew him there, went into the ruler's tent, and quickly, without further ado, stabbed the founder of the Lithuanian state and his two young sons. After that, the prince also quietly left the camp. Lithuania was only provoked by the murder of the first ruler. Everyone began to actively divide the lands they inherited, and kill each other in all possible ways. And Prince Davmont eventually fled to Pskov, converted to Orthodoxy there and even became a local saint. Mindovg did not leave a good memory for herself. For a long time they tried not to remember him at all, and this is not surprising. Because the Middle Ages is a very religious time, and Mindovg, apparently, managed to give almost all the main religions. On the other hand, the 13th century was so complicated that everything was betrayed there. The Pope put his new kings, scoring to help against the Mongols. One of these kings, Daniel of Galicia, eventually rejected the patronage of the Pope in response, and moved to Lithuania on the side of the Mongols. And Alexander Nevsky, too, is often called a traitor, which does not interfere with his loud fame. However, it is explained by the fact that the Moscow princes led their ancestry from Nevsky, who glorified their first ancestor in every possible way, and the dark spots of his biography were hushed up or justified. But Mindovg was so unlucky, for 7 years after his death, all his descendants were killed in one way or another, and there was no one to return the good memory of his reign. It was not possible to create a dynasty and a mouth, and they simply preferred to forget about Mindovg for a long time. All subsequent Lithuanian rulers tried to carry on their state tradition from anywhere, but not from the first and last king of Lithuania. And only in the 20th century, it was pulled out of oblivion by young Lithuanian and Belarusian intellectuals, who needed it to build their own national narrative. The old prince was cleaned of the dirt that stuck to him, slightly dressed up, and named the wise founder of the ancient state. After that, he began to look no worse than the founding princes of various neighbors. And actually, this is quite an instructive story, because in fact, the difference between all these rulers has really never been so huge. Thanks to patrons and patronesses, as well as to our friends who support this channel. I remind you that if you have a foreign card, go to Patreon, or to Boost if you have a Russian card, if you want to support us. This helps us very much to plan videos in advance, and you can also watch videos without integrative advertising very first. And you can also ask us questions in the chat if you have any. In any case, thanks to everyone who watches this, do not forget to like the video, and subscribe to the channel. And write in the comments what you think about the founder of the Lithuanian state. Is he really that terrible? Thank you all. I hope you were interested, but we'll see you soon.